it's me, Julian, and in this live stream lecture, I would like to give you a short and simple introduction to Slavoj Žižek's book, Surplus Enjoyment, A Guide to the Non-Perplexed. And what I'm going to try to do in the next half hour or so is lay out Žižek's basic argument, his solution, his remedy, as it were, as well as give you some basic formulas and introductions, definitions even, when it comes to the concept of surplus enjoyment, or the Freudian concept of Lustgewinn. All that and more coming up in the next 30 minutes or so. But first, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody joining me live today. It gives me such pleasure and satisfaction knowing that we are connecting philosophically across the world. That's always been my dream, to make quote-unquote difficult philosophical concepts accessible and thereby to create a community of like-minded thinkers and students. So thank you for being here. And a huge thank you also to the patrons who continue to make this project possible in the first place. I simply wouldn't be able to host these sessions and prepare for them without you. So thank you. And if you'd like to become a patron, you can go to the link. I'll put it in my description. And as a patron, you can download my complete guide to Žižek series, volumes 1 through 8. It's essentially an ebook introduction to Žižek, which is ongoing, as well as the audio for my live stream lectures, edited transcripts courtesy of Jeneline, as well as a weekly bonus seminar that I record immediately after this lecture. So that's all on Patreon. Let us begin with this lecture. Okay. So as I said before, the goal of this lecture is to provide you with a basic introduction to Slavoj Žižek's book, Surplus Enjoyment, A Guide to the Non-Perplexed. And I'll give you a very simple 1-minute breakdown of his main argument, his problematic, as well as his goal, his solution. And then we can kind of fill in the blanks in a more conceptual way. So Žižek's basic argument in this book is that we live in a supposedly permissive society that suffocates desire, leading to depression. In other words, the superego injunction within a capitalist society is enjoy, lead your best life. And it makes it relatively easy to access things that we're supposed to enjoy. We've never been able to more easily access music. We've never been more easily able to access romantic partners or pornography. It's easier to find junk food and soda drinks, etc., sugar water. In a sense, we have everything. We have abundance. We have everything we need in order to be happy. And yet, nevertheless, we are more depressed than ever. We are more unsatisfied than ever. There's a longing, a void within us that we are unable to fill. And the way in which Žižek puts that quite technically is he says that, quote unquote, the superego injunction to enjoy regulates the libidinal economy of our so-called permissive societies. Basically, Slavoj Žižek is arguing that even though it's become easier than ever to access the supposed objects of our enjoyment, nevertheless, we remain more depressed, more unsatisfied than ever before. And his remedy, or his goal, is, quote unquote, to articulate the existential stance which would enable us to break out of this deadlock of permissiveness. And what is this existential stance by which we can break free from the deadlock of permissiveness? Well, according to Slavoj Žižek, it is what he calls subjective destitution. In fact, part of the goal of this book is to lay out a cultural, political, and philosophical psychoanalytic framework for his theory of subjective destitution, or his Hegelian reading thereof. So what is subjective destitution? I'll give you a highly simplified version. Essentially, subjective destitution is the process by which we become radically subject to something that goes above or beyond ourselves. In other words, to put it somewhat dramatically, subjective destitution is when you find something that you are willing to die for. And Žižek says the key here is to avoid a certain perversion that is implicit within a fundamentalist attitude towards subjective destitution, which is to say, a religious fundamentalist will say, I am acting on behalf of God. My entire life is dedicated to the service of God. I am an instrument of God's will. And Žižek says here we have one form of subjective destitution, However, this is the pervert's version of subjective destitution. Why? Well, because you make yourself the agent of the big other's will, or you make yourself the one who pleasures the big other. Therefore, for Žižek, the goal is to articulate a form of subjective destitution that doesn't fall into this trap of perversion. How do we become radically subject to something above or beyond ourselves without simply making ourselves a desubjectivized agent, an automata of the big other's will? And Žižek says that for himself, his version of subjective destitution is to make everything he does about philosophy, that he's unable to watch a movie or enjoy anything in life unless he feels like it somehow serves his philosophical project, i.e., it's something that he can put into a book. And so his subjective destitution is therefore his subjective destitution to the project of philosophy, specifically his Hegelianism. In fact, in the opening to this book, which he calls the overture to the book, he says that the central animating principle of this book follows the Freudian principle of Verneinung, or the logic of denial. And the example that Freud uses is that someone says, well, I had a dream, but I know one thing for certain, it was not about my mother. Of course, here we have an obvious case of which the dream is definitely about that person's mother. And Žižek says that the same is true for this book, that this book is not about Hegel, but in a sense it is absolutely, definitely about Hegel. So to reframe briefly, the most simplified version of what this book's problematic is and what its solution is that Žižek argues that we are depressed. We are alienated from ourselves. And the reason we are depressed is because we live in a supposedly permissive society that tells us that it is our duty to enjoy ourselves, to be happy. And yet, even though the things that are supposed to make us happy are more within our reach than ever before, nevertheless, we remain unhappy, we remain unfulfilled. And this problem for Žižek can only be solved by what he calls subjective destitution, which is an existential stance that allows us to break free from this deadlock of permissiveness, the so-called permissive society. Now, here's important to note that Žižek says in the opening to this book that he actually situates himself as a moderate conservative, which might be a little bit surprising, but essentially what Žižek is arguing is that he is a conservative communist, or perhaps, if you will, a conservative progressive. The way in which Žižek puts it is like this. He says, we live amidst the quote-unquote mess of alt-right obscenities and the pseudo-leftist, politically correct, moralist rigidity. And between these two poles of alt-right obscenities, the ironic, cynical stance towards identity politics, etc., and the flip side of it, the moralist rigidity of politically correct, virtue-signaling identity politics, Žižek situates himself supposedly in the middle. And yet it's important to note here that Žižek isn't claiming to be a centrist. Instead, he essentially is arguing that he is a conservative communist. Now, what would a conservative communist be? For Žižek, a conservative communist is someone who is a conservative except for the fact that he does not argue for a return to any given normal or previous version of society. Instead, he's conservative on a moral standpoint when it comes to civility, decency, actually reading the classics, etc., high humanist education. However, Žižek argues that this conservatism is precisely what makes him a progressive, what makes him a communist, which is to say that his realization is that we cannot go back. We cannot make undone the contemporary crisis of the so-called end of ideology. In fact, Žižek argues in the introduction that we are living in the end of ideology. It's a little bit like the famous phrase from Gramsci, where he says that the old is dying, but the new has not yet been born. And amidst this time, a host of morbid symptoms appears. And Žižek's project is to dedicate his intellectual and mental energy to the analysis of these breaking points, of these morbid symptoms. Therefore, he is a conservative to the extent that he believes in the idea of careful, philosophical, classicist analysis, and yet he remains nevertheless progressive and communist in that he believes that we cannot stage a return to what once was or what we believe once was. Instead, Zizek's argument is that therefore we have to move into this uncertain, this unknowable future. In fact, he concludes the book by citing G.K. Chesterton's definition of courage. G.K. Chesterton's definition of courage is that you have to fight as if you were ready to die, and yet nevertheless cling on to life. And that this paradoxical stance of fighting as if you were willing to give it everything, and yet nevertheless doing what you can in order not to die, this for Žižek is subjective destitution. Namely, fighting for everything that you believe in and everything that you believe to be right, and yet not fighting so as to stage a return, but fighting so as to preserve it in its new guise in the future. Or as G.K. Chesterton puts it, we must drink water like life and death like wine. It's the dramatic, somewhat melodramatic, if you will, conclusion to Žižek's book. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to talk a little bit about what is the central concept of this book, namely surplus enjoyment. And perhaps it's worth noting that the subtitle for this book is A Guide to the Non-Perplexed. So why is this a guide to the non-perplexed? Essentially, Žižek's argument is that this is not a guide for beginners. This is not a guide for the people he calls the perplexed, the people who don't know what philosophy or critical theory is. Instead, this is a book for the already initiated, which is to say it's a book that he's written for people who are already familiar with critical theory, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. But beyond that, there's also a political goal, which is to say that if you find yourself perplexed at the world that we're living in right now, which Žižek characterizes as the Hegelian verkehrte Welt, or the topsy-turvy world, if you find yourself perplexed as to the manifest contradictions of the current socio-political constellation of our given historical moment, then you are the right audience for this book. In other words, it is a guide for the non-perplexed, namely those who have already articulated a philosophical framework by which to make sense of their perplexion. It's almost like an in-joke, as it were. So you could say, for example, if you're watching this video right now, you are already part of the non-perplexed. Namely, you have already identified your perplexion and you are trying to philosophize about it. Now, let's look at the central title, Surplus Enjoyment. What I'd like to do for the next 10 minutes or so is give you a basic definition of surplus enjoyment and why it's so important for Žižek's argument here. Remember, his central stance is that we live in a supposedly permissive society in which we're supposed to enjoy ourselves. In fact, the capitalist imperative, the superego injunction, is precisely to enjoy, to live our best life. And yet we find ourselves caught in a deadlock of permissiveness, which is to say, we're allowed to do everything, supposedly, and yet this very permissiveness makes us unhappy. It makes us unfulfilled. It makes us repressed or even depressed. It's, in a sense, Žižek is asking a very Schopenhauerian question. Schopenhauer already wrote, what is it that makes the youth depressed? And Žižek says, what is it that makes the youth depressed? Well, what makes us depressed is that we don't understand how satisfaction works. We don't understand how happiness works. We don't understand how enjoyment works. Therefore, one of the keys towards articulating what he calls an existential stance that would allow us to enable a move beyond this deadlock of permissiveness is to understand the concept of surplus enjoyment. Okay, so what is surplus enjoyment? Essentially, surplus enjoyment is Lacan's articulation of, or a combination, if you will, Lacan's combination of Marx and Freud. Namely, the Marxist concept of surplus profit, Mehrgewinn in German, and the Freudian concept of essentially Lustgewinn, which is a gain upon your pleasure. And essentially what Lacan does is he combines the logic of Mehrgewinn with the logic of Lustgewinn. In fact, Lacan's argument is that capitalism, in the idea of surplus profit or Lustgewinn, Mehrwert, I'm confusing myself here. Lacan's argument is that the capitalist logic, the logic of surplus profit, already stages in its functioning the Freudian theory of Lustgewinn. And Lacan has a beautiful formula for this, a chiastic formula. He says, what happens within capitalism is that we count our pleasure, namely pleasure as profit. We count our pleasure, which leads us to take pleasure in the counting. We count our pleasure as profit. We count our pleasure, which leads us to take pleasure in the counting. And Lacan essentially says that this is the surplus enjoyment of the capitalist, which is to say he's not making money simply so as to have money, to acquire goods. He's counting his money and he's making money for the sake of making more, which is to say that what brings him joy is not the money, nor the experiences that he can buy with the money, but instead the very process of accumulation itself is enjoyable for the capitalist. It's a little bit like Schopenhauer's maxim that as soon as we start enjoying money in the abstract, we lose the ability to enjoy it in the concrete, which is to say that as soon as we no longer want to buy something with the money or enable ourselves to do something with the money, then we start enjoying having money as such, or making money with money. Lacan's basic formula there, his reduction, is that capitalist Mehrgewinn, or surplus profit, follows the Freudian principle of Lustgewinn, or surplus enjoyment. Once again, his formula is that when we count pleasure, this leads us to take pleasure in counting. So what's important to note here is that Žižek says that we can take this Lacanian formula and apply it as a general definition of surplus enjoyment überhaupt, which is to say that Žižek's definition of surplus enjoyment is, quote, the additional pleasure provided by the formal detours in the subject's efforts to obtain pleasure. Or, if we want to put it in a more Lacanian chiasmic maxim, it is that the renunciation of pleasure leads to pleasure in renunciation. I'll say it one more time. The renunciation of pleasure leads to pleasure in the renunciation. Here we have what for Žižek is the sexual or the enjoyment dimension of the Hegelian verkehrte Welt, or topsy-turvy, namely loss as its own gain. Which is to say, what brings us enjoyment is not the object of our enjoyment, but paradoxically, the brutal and difficult path that we take towards satisfying our desire, towards the object of enjoyment. It's a little bit like a psychoanalytic take on saying that the journey is itself the reward. And what's important to note here, I think this is key, is that surplus enjoyment is not extra enjoyment, which is to say surplus enjoyment is not additional enjoyment. It's not like you get to enjoy the thing, but then you can have another thing and that gives you surplus enjoyment. For example, it's not like you have a Big Mac and then you choose to supersize it and this gives you additional enjoyment. Instead, and this is really, really important, for Lacan and Žižek, enjoyment is always already this surplus. Which is to say that the problem of enjoyment is that we can never access it directly. We can never access it in a normal way. Instead, the only enjoyment is the enjoyment of surplus. And vice versa is precisely the idea that you could access enjoyment directly in a quote-unquote normal way that denies us enjoyment, that keeps us forever barred from it. In fact, this goes back to Žižek's argument. The so-called permissive society that we live in wants to give us direct access to enjoyment. But it's precisely because of this direct access to enjoyment, because of the removal or elimination of the barriers to said enjoyment, that we are no longer able to enjoy. Therefore, paradoxically, the removal of the barriers or obstacles towards enjoyment leads to its very opposite, to a kind of depression and alienation. Which is to say, what brings us enjoyment is precisely surplus enjoyment. It's the excessive kernel of enjoyment that lies above and beyond, but also within enjoyment as such. Now, one thing that I think is quite interesting here, to deviate briefly, but to remain within the argument, is that This formula that Lacan has, the renunciation of pleasure leads to pleasure in renunciation, can also be applied as the elementary formula of hysteria, which is to say, the formula of hysteria, when put in chiastic terms, is repression of desire leads to desire for repression. And I'll say it one more time. Repression of desire leads to desire for repression. And here we have the central problem of the hysteric. The hysteric's question to the other, the hysteric's demand to the other, is meant to go unfulfilled. Hence why Žižek says that a lot of contemporary protests are hysterical. Namely, they make a demand upon the other that they already anticipate will be denied. For example, when protesters look towards Joe Biden and say, we want you to end the war in Gaza, implicitly they are already expecting to be denied. Therefore, the hysterical stance is repression of desire leads to a desire for repression. Therefore, the repression of the protests is what is desired, becomes its very vindicating stance. And Žižek says that there's something dishonest to this hysterical stance, which asks for something seemingly impossible so as to be reaffirmed in its own ideological naivete, as it were. This is what Žižek likes to relate, although he doesn't do it in the opening here, to the Hegelian theory of the liberal heart and the liberal soul. But I'll do that in another video. So the basic point here is that hysteria and the formula of hysteria is in fact the outcome of a society that wants direct enjoyment, wants direct access to enjoyment. Think about it. If renunciation of pleasure leads to pleasure in renunciation, then vice versa. If you directly access pleasure, it disappears. It is no longer there. Like, if you suddenly are able to access every piece of music that has ever existed, it becomes really difficult to enjoy that power. In the same way that if you had access to every single sexual partner, bereft of the process of romantic conquest, it would lose its very essence. It would lose what makes it enjoyable. It would lose its sexual dimension. Therefore, the sexual dimension lies in the romantic pursuit, inasmuch as the dimension of desire or enjoyment lies within the barrier or obstacle to be overcome. And so if we make it too easy to acquire what we're supposed to want or what we think we want, we thereby no longer can properly enjoy it. And this leads us into a hysteric stance. After all, if the hysteric is the repression of desire leading to desire for repression, then if we can directly access the object of our enjoyment, but the object of enjoyment is already hollowed out from within by means of its accessibility, this means that we have, in fact, repressed our desire. We don't get what we want. We don't get to be who we want to be or live how we're told to live. And this leads us to a desire for repression, which is to say that we actually invite and enjoy the mechanisms of oppression that we are subject to. Hence, the political protest is simply the outward manifestation of this desire for repression. Let me take a step back here, because I realize that I'm introducing a lot of things. Žižek's argument, therefore, is that Lustgewinn, or the gain of pleasure, is something that paradoxically happens not when we achieve what we want, but precisely when we are barred from it, when we're constitutively separated from it. Which is to say, pain as the... Or actually, let me rephrase this, because Žižek has a good take on this. The famous bodybuilding slogan, "No pain, no gain," should be rephrased as "the pain is the gain," which is to say, one of the paradoxes of enjoyment from a Lacanian perspective is that we enjoy the punishment. We enjoy the brutal part. We don't actually enjoy the reward. The reward is empty. It's immaterial. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. As soon as you've reached the thing that you thought you wanted, it's immaterial. It's no longer there. In fact, if your entire goal in life is to get to a point at which you believe yourself to be happy, like once I have this job or this trophy, or once I've accomplished X, then as soon as you've reached that very thing, your reason to live disappears. You become deeply unhappy and depressed. Therefore, the easier it becomes to achieve that thing, the more likely you are to become depressed. And paradoxically, vice versa, the more difficult it becomes to reach that goal, the more that goal is prolonged, the more access you have to enjoyment. It's a little bit like if you're a fan of a sports team that always loses. Even though you're losing, which is painful, there's the pleasure of eventually winning, which is thereby so much greater than the satisfaction of a team that wins all the time, that never loses. It's a little bit like this process of extending your pleasure over time so as to have a bigger climax, to be Žižekian for a moment. Now, essentially what this means is that we don't know how to be happy. We don't know how to be fulfilled. We don't know how to desire. And one of the things that happens within a contemporary consumer and capitalist society is that we are told that being happy is an imperative. In fact, that it is part of a social good. That unless you are able to make yourself happy, you have in some sense not only failed society, but failed yourself. Therefore, the superego injunction, to put it in psychoanalytic terms, is to give in to your id, to make yourself subservient to your id as if it were a superego imperative or injunction. And this leads to a deadlock, which Žižek calls the deadlock of permissive societies. And now you can understand why Žižek thinks that he is a conservative here. When Žižek says that he is conservative, he's essentially making an argument that things are supposed to be hard, that if things become too easy, that we become too weak, as it were. That if we simply give in to instant gratification, we lose the essential dimension of satisfaction, but more importantly, we lose the essential dimension of courage and will and perseverance. Everything that makes life worth living, everything that makes subjectivity necessary, thereby disappears when we shorten the gap between our desire and the object of our desire. And here what's really important is that Žižek says that he identifies as a conservative. However, he wants to identify a form of conservatism that does not posit a return to a pre-existing symbolic order, and perhaps more importantly, that does not succumb to a reactionary or totalitarian stance on life. Which Žižek's point isn't that we should go back to a world in which men were real men, in which hardness was something that developed your character, etc. This is totally not Žižek's point. His point is not that life is too easy and that this creates weak men and that we should therefore create hardship for these people. It's the exact opposite. It's that life has become unbearably hard precisely because it is too easy. That the malaise of the society of permissiveness is that we are unable to enjoy, that we are unable to access the crucial dimension of enjoyment. Therefore, Žižek's argument, paradoxically, is that the only way to truly give in to our desire, in fact, to follow the Lacanian maxim, to be loyal to one's desire, is precisely by rejecting easy, simplified desire. Therefore, Žižek's conservative stance on desire is saying, in order to be true hedonists, in order to be true revolutionary subjects, we must be loyal to our desire, thereby giving in or giving away the idea of easy, accessible, instant gratification. Not so that we might become hard men who have been shaped by hardship, but so that we might become truly free, so that we might truly enjoy once again. And I think that's a crucial thing about Žižek's conservative argument. Now, I want to end with the context of this book in which it was written, which is to say Žižek writes this shortly after the COVID pandemic, at least let's say the era of its crisis in which there were lockdowns, etc. And there used to be a joke in the 1920s and 30s, which was that anti-Semitism was essentially communism for idiots. And Žižek essentially makes the same argument. He says that the anti-vax stance is anti-capitalism for idiots. That what has happened within the last 4 years is that a host of different anti-consumerist and anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarianist stances have all become tied together and enmeshed. And there are all these weird and new alliances that have formed that nevertheless are deeply contradictory. And Žižek's point in this book is to pull at all of these separate threads, to tug away at these contradictions, these imminent differences that have emerged symptomatically against the backdrop of the COVID pandemic, and therefore to start articulating a new theory of post-COVID capitalist experience. And so it's important to note that Žižek actually editorializes in the beginning of this book by saying that this is a book that is unfocused. It is a book that is unstructured. And in this lack of focus, in this lack of structure, it mirrors the chaotic times of our current predicament. Which is to say, Žižek says that there are essentially two ways in which catastrophe functions. Either it's a brutal event that shatters the symbolic fictions that sustain our reality. Or, perhaps worse, what we are suffering today is that reality supposedly stays the same. There is no brutal event, and yet nevertheless, the symbolic fiction slowly dissolves. And it is Žižek's attempt in this book to articulate an analysis and a critique of the way in which these symbolic fictions are slowly dissolving, and why for him, the concept of surplus enjoyment is the crucial question of our times. Namely, to rephrase once again, how we might articulate the existential stance which would enable us to break out of the deadlock of permissiveness, thereby genuinely accessing enjoyment. And, to follow the Lacanian maxim, to remain true to our desire. That is my introduction to Slavoj Žižek's Surplus Enjoyment. If you're interested, for the next week or so, I can do some shorter videos on the individual chapters. I think that might be worth doing. Perhaps especially on the concept of subjective destitution, which I simplified here to the extreme. On that note, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to download my ebook Introduction to Žižek, called The Complete Guide to Žižek Volumes 1 through 8, please do consider becoming a patron. And a thank you to everybody who joined live today. I'll be hosting a bonus seminar for patrons immediately after this session on Discord. And if you'd like to download those bonus seminars, you can find them on Patreon in the lowest tier. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.